And we're 3 minutes until we start, so I'm just going to show for the last time this video that introduces complicated grief.
Love is an essential part of the foundational bedrock of human life. Losing a loved one creates a fault line in this foundation. After someone dies, it's natural to experience acute grief. For most people, grief never completely goes away but recedes into the background. Over time, the pain of loss diminishes, but memories of a loved one remain deeply interwoven in a person's mind, defining their history and coloring their views of the world. But complicated grief is different. It takes hold of a person's mind and won't let go. They're faced with seemingly insurmountable aftershocks impeding their rebuilding process. They experience long-lasting, intense feelings that dominate their lives. They know their loved one is gone, but they still can't believe it. They often say they feel stuck, that time is moving on, but they are not. They have strong yearnings for the person who died that don't seem to lessen as time goes on. Thoughts and memories of the deceased person fill their mind. They may also have strong feelings of anger related to the death and find it hard to imagine that life without the deceased person has meaning. Moving forward is like trying to get a foothold in a ravaged landscape littered with obstacles. Community support is important for successfully overcoming complicated grief.
All right, that was our last viewing of this video, but it's available on Columbia School of Social Work's YouTube channel if you'd like to view it again or show it to coworkers. So we're up to 74 folks who are responding to this poll. We've got Denver, welcome. So I'm going to do a final welcome to folks. Denver, Berkeley, Ohio, Vermont, Arkansas, Michigan, California, Philly, New York, Virginia, Michigan again, great, Washington, Seattle, Quincy, and Nigeria, of course, can't forget, and Las Vegas. So welcome, everybody. All right, we're at 1 o'clock, so we're going to get officially started. So welcome, welcome, and I'm going to do a very quick introduction to Adobe Connect for those who are new to using it. So I'm going to make the slides bigger here to show you. So we're very glad that you're here with us today, and we hope that you'll participate all throughout the event. If you need to log out and log back in, you can do so just by closing your browser. And you might want to do that if you're using Chrome if you experience any issues, because there's some unpredictable issues that come up sometimes just with Chrome. Please chat all throughout. We love that. We don't consider it rude. I know some people worry about that, but we love it. So please feel free to chat all throughout, and I'll be collecting your questions to save for the Q&A at the end. So if you think of a question now, feel free to type it in. If you would find it easier to have a larger font size, you can change your font size up here in sort of the menu area, and then you can change your text size and change it to whatever font size you'd like. And if the chat bothers you, it's also your choice if you'd like to just cover it up. Here we're using a Post-it note to cover it up. That's an option for you. If you'd like to download our handouts for today, which include our slides, you can do so here on the left. This is the pose of the image on the slide here. Just click on the name of the file you'd like and then click to download it. And you've been responding to polls already, but just if you are not sure how to do it, just type in or click on a circle or a square. And you'll know that it worked because it'll say this answer submitted, or you'll see the circle or the square change a little bit. And finally, especially when we talk about politics, it can be a little contentious, so we just ask that everyone have a respectful and civil conversation here today. And with that, I'd like to welcome up Marileah Coxawanahara, who's our Director of Marketing and Communication.
Tia, hi everyone. I'm really happy to see all the people who've turned out today. This is our 7th online event. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Mary Leah Cox-O'Hara, the Director of Marketing and Communications for the Columbia School of Social Work. And the best part of my job is getting to meet graduates of our school who are doing some extraordinary things with their MSWs. And today's featured guest, Walter Vega, is a great example. Walter, would you like to come in? Oh, there he is.
Hi there, Maria.
Hey, Walter.
Hi.
Welcome.
Thanks.
And I know you're no stranger to the Columbia School of Social Work. Not only are you an alum, but you've also taught here and you set up our Department of Advising. And I also know you're a star teacher, because whenever I interview students when they're about to graduate, they always mention your classes as a highlight. So we're happy to have you here. I think the best way to introduce you, though, would be to show the little video we made about you.
I remember my first day in my first direct practice class, and while I thought, okay, I'm going to be learning about mental health issues and diagnosis, and then I realized that it wasn't about that so much. It was about really learning about the person in the environment. And I think Columbia did such a nice job of helping me think systemically. When I was in grad school, I think I really knew that I wanted to work with children. But then as I was at the field placement fair, which many first-year students go to as they decide on their second-year placement, funny enough, one of the booths I went to was the Center for Family Life. And that was the after-school program that I attended as a kid. And I said, whoa, and I spoke to the person who was at the booth, a social worker there, and I told her I'm from Sunset Park. And she says, that's great. You should come and see if you can intern at our place. And I said, that sounds perfect, actually. And it was there that I really started learning about the value and the rewards of working with families. What sets us apart as a discipline is that person and environment perspective is always thinking systemically. And family therapy is about thinking systemically, thinking relationally. So there's the social aspect of social work, and then there's the work part of it. It takes work, and for me the work part is that moving mountains piece, which is about looking at how larger systems impact the relationships and the lives of people, and sometimes in really oppressive ways.
Hi, Donald John Trump.
This election and having Donald Trump as president has actually torn some families apart. So there's the election, and following right after are, for many people in this country, is Thanksgiving, right? And then the winter holidays, right? That's oftentimes when families come together. And I can't tell you how many times I came across, right, people saying, my father voted for Trump, or my uncle voted for Trump, or my grandmother voted for Trump. I can't go. And whereas family therapists, our job is to be able to talk across differences, this one's a hard one. I'm the firstborn child of an immigrant mother, right, from Honduras. My mother was undocumented for many years. So I grew up with this fear that at any point she could get deported. As a kid, I didn't really know what the chances were exactly. I didn't know about immigration policy back then, but I was terrified. Now, in 1986, Ronald Reagan declared this amnesty, and she was able to get her permanent residence as a result. But now we're back to this place, right, where folks maybe had a sense that things were okay, and there was a path to gaining some sort of security. Now that's totally up in the air. And I think that's generated a tremendous amount of anxiety. Personally, for me, this is a really scary time. I have to go through a period of mourning, really. It really is like a sense of mourning, of grieving. And then with all grief, we have to think about, like, how do we move forward? But it's taken me some time. One of the things about having a history of being oppressed is that with that, there is somewhere a history of resistance. Once we sort of process some of that grief, once we think through what we're afraid of happening, we can get to a point of saying, okay, now what are we going to do about this? Where people get stuck, though, is how do I keep this going, In the first, I would say 2 months, there was a lot of energy poured into into rallies and protests and marches. And we've been seeing small things here and there, but I think, how do you keep this fire alive? And then you'll see, while that's happening, another executive order, right, being passed. And then you drop your head and you go, oh, okay, I got to pick myself back up again. But that really was that was another blow. So I don't know if by Kathy's definition, it seems complicated to me, but it's a grieving process that is definitely extended. And it's amazing how healing the power of organizing is, the power of resistance is. I mean, being energized in that way, I think is empowering, and I think that's the stage that we're at.
Well, I love that video, Walter, especially the part about your growing up. And I'm just wondering, I get to ask 3 questions from my non-specialist perspective before we hand over to the amazing Dr. Kathy Shear. But since the 5 months that have passed, since the election outcome was decided, what stands out for you as
Mary
having
Lee,
been your most
first of all,
difficult moment
let's
with a
remember
client?
that the election took place on a Tuesday, right? And so many of us had to go back to work the next day. And I think so. I began seeing people both in a number of jobs that I do, but in my private practice, right? The immediate sense of shock for many people.
Walter, I'm sorry. I'm just going to jump in and ask you to hold the mic up closer
Sure.
to your mouth.
The immediate sense of shock that people were experiencing right after the election. One person that stands out for me quite a bit is this young woman I work with. One of the places where I work is a higher ed opportunity program called the SEEK program at John Jay College. Now, this young lady, 18, 19 years old, she came to this country when she was 5 years old from the Dominican Republic and had been undocumented ever since. And she had benefited from DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And so was, did not really have to worry about the threat of deportation or that the federal government would take any kind of action against her. And that allowed her a lot of opportunities to pursue her education. When she got to college, she also benefited from a dream scholarship. So she is a dreamer. And in so many ways, right, this is a young lady who had really planted her roots in this country and in every sense of the word, became American. And then after the election, when this country voted in President Trump, someone whose rhetoric very much speaks against many immigrants, she was not quite sure what that meant for her. In fact, she was terrified that all of the work and all of the efforts that she had made in this country had just gone by the wayside, and now she was not sure what her future held. So that, for me, I mean, the very next day after the election was a story that I heard and has stayed with me ever since.
Yeah, that is moving, and I'm also wondering
Yeah,
actually,
well, I mean,
how
as
about for
I
you
think
personally,
in
what's
the
been the
bit right
most
before, I think
difficult
as
moment?
you all heard, right, in addition to being someone who grew up with an undocumented parent, I mean, I think one of the things I'd want to say, Mary Leah, right off the bat is that this is, even though there may be many people who are impacted by this who I don't directly know, I think anybody who's living in the country right now has to be impacted by this.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps for me, the biggest piece was the next day when I actually had to talk to my 8-year-old daughter about what this all meant. To her, she was expecting a different outcome, and how to explain to her that this person who represented, I don't know, in many ways, someone who represented to be a big bully, as far as she was concerned, had won. And I had to help her make sense of that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I actually think, at least for us adults, we can sort of understand that there's these forces afoot in our society that can be unleashed, but it must be very hard to explain that to a child. And actually, I have one last question, which is, you mentioned in the video that there's grieving going on, and we have Kathy Shear here today, who's an expert on grief and complicated grief.
Yeah.
But what
Well,
exactly
I
are
think
we
even though I think
grieving?
we
What
before
has
this election,
died,
even though certainly
you
we
know?
had a long road ahead of us, Mary Leah, in terms of a sense of social progress, I think we were making major strides in this country. I think we were making major strides to a more just world, frankly. And while, again, I don't want to sound like I was, I'm certainly deluded into thinking we were there, but we were certainly headed in the right direction. And then when this election took place and Donald Trump won the election, in many ways it now was a major setback for that. And I think what many of us are experiencing is a loss of hope, frankly, is a loss of hope of what this country could have been, is a loss of hope for all the strides that we had made to have been lost. And I think for many of us that in many ways we experience that as a death.
Right. Yeah.
Or that we could
Well,
have
I think
been.
it's the loss of the country we thought we lived in, we thought we knew. That's how it
Well, that's a good note right there.
to me. Yeah.
That's a perfect transition time, so thank you both very much. And with that, I'd like to invite up Professor Catherine Shear, who is the founding director of the Center for Complicated Grief.
Hi, Mattia. So thanks so much, and welcome to all of you and to this very interesting discussion. And I just want to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing in the Center for Complicated Grief really now for the past 2 decades or so, has been really focused on death, loss as death. But we experience grief as the natural reaction to loss, and it doesn't have to be a death, of course. We grieve the loss of so many things in our lives that matter to us. So we grieve when we care about something, when we lose something that we care about. And grief, I want to say, it's a painful experience. It's not just an emotion. It's not one emotion. It's really, we think of it as a full body, and actually more than body, it's a community response to loss, especially in a situation like this. But even when an individual dies, the family members or those closest to that person might experience the loss most intensely, but the whole, a much larger community experiences that loss. So grief is is really that response. And generally speaking, grief is with us after we lose something that matters to us, especially if the loss is in any way permanent. Then the grief is also going to be permanent. But it's not one thing. It's not one thing even when it first emerges, but it's not one thing over time. It gradually finds a place in our lives, is what it does. And it does that as we adapt to the changes that are brought about by the loss. And of course, adaptation is really, in some sense, the fundamental meaning of being alive. Because we have to always, being alive means we can adapt to our environment, adapt to changes. And sometimes we even adapt to positive changes. But in this case, we're talking about adapting to an unwanted change. And, certainly the death of someone we love is very much so an unwanted change. But we've come to think of that as a kind of just one example of how we do adapt to unwanted change, which is very relevant to today's discussion. So let me just say a couple more words about that, about how it is that we believe that what we need to do to adapt to an unwanted change, especially when the change is something that has been very important, a loss of something important to us, essentially a loss of something that is identity defining. And that's the case when we lose someone we love, because we do define ourselves in part by the people we love. That's very natural. That's actually a characteristic of a very positive, meaningful relationship. And similarly, we define ourselves by the community in which we live and by the value system and the sort of way that our actions and our policies in the community in which we live. And of course, that's what we're talking about today. So the three things that we need to do to adapt to an unwanted change are, first of all, we have to accept the reality of the change. So we may want to say no. I certainly woke up the first day after the election saying to myself, no, it didn't really happen. There's some mistake here. We should be able to go back and redo it, and it'll come out differently. And I think a lot of us maybe are still a little bit feeling that, but we really, it isn't true. It did happen, and we have to accept that reality. And then we have to understand what it means to us. So we have to accept the reality, understand what it means to us, and then find some way to envision a future that has possibilities for joy and satisfaction, and where we can still have a sense of purpose and meaning in our lives. And as we do that, we are going to, basically, we're going to find a way to maintain our relationship to, if it's a person who died, it's to that person. We sometimes call that continuing bonds. But in this case, where we're talking about a kind of life, a kind of community that we value, a community that shares our values, a community in which, as Walter said so eloquently, we were on our way to move forward to making that community really the place that we all want it to be, that we think it's so important for it to be. And then all of a sudden that's lost. But we need to hold on to a part of what we had before. So we will hold on to it. We're not going to forget it. We don't want to forget it. Instead, we want to kind of revise our relationship to those values, to that other way of life that can then kind of inform that way that we move forward. And in this case, maybe it has to do with some kind of political activism or whatever. So with that in mind, I'd like to actually invite Walter to join me here again. And thank you so much, Walter, for all that you do and for your wonderful video. I really, really enjoyed that video. I knew, of course, we know each other and we've worked a little bit together, but I didn't know some of your more personal story, which I feel, filled with admiration for, actually. And I think it's a wonderful kind of history to bring into your work generally, and certainly into this discussion. But right now, let's find out a little bit more about the other people here. So we have a poll, and let's see whether, how have you guys been impacted really by the election? Yeah. So I see people are already answering this. Right. Yeah. Do you want to?
Yeah. No. It's interesting just to see where people are at in all of this. We can see a number of people, right, have been experiencing a great degree of anxiety since the election. And, one of the things that I say, Kathy, I would be curious to hear your thoughts of it, is that I think, right, I've dealt with a number of folks, particularly folks from marginalized communities that I think live already with a certain kind of baseline level of anxiety, because if you're feeling that, your voice is not heard, if you're feeling you're not being acknowledged as legitimate, as valid, and then this election creating an environment where I would say we're living now against an even larger backdrop of anxiety. I think people find that very distressing. So it would make sense that folks here, a number of people would be experiencing that kind of anxiety. I've been seeing it quite a bit. I don't know about in your work.
Absolutely. I think, I absolutely think that it's hard to imagine how anyone who has been, who's socially conscious, let's say, anyone who works in a social work school almost would feel some anxiety about where are we going from here? What's going to happen to the vulnerable individuals whose lives we care about so very much, we experience anxiety for a lot of reasons. When we experience anxiety when we see a threat to something that we care about, which we certainly do see that here, and also when there's uncertainty, and uncertainty will typically, trigger anxiety. And there's so much uncertainty in the world that we're living in right now, globally, as well as, and also, basically related to the election. Right, so we are all, virtually all of us in the room are experiencing anxiety. It's not surprising.
Yeah, I think that uncertainty, just to speak to that, Kathy, right? I would say I certainly, and I noticed some of the comments earlier that people were making about, living in places that are pretty securely on the more democratic or liberal side, right? Having a sense of shock, right, during the election. There was a pretty strong sense by many people that the outcome that took place wouldn't have happened. And so when there was a sense of that kind of almost certainty about that, and then you get this sense of surprise all of a sudden, the sense of shock, it's like, wait a minute, if that wasn't a sure thing, then what is, right? And to have that kind of uncertainty enter your life, whether it was a clear sense of security or not, but when it enters your life in that way, I think that's really dysregulating for folks. And it leads to a sense of a lack of control, essentially, that you really have, no ability to control what's going on in the world around you. And that's pretty distressing.
Yeah, definitely. So I just want to comment about a couple of the other, I totally agree with what you're saying. And, it seems like a lot of people are actually endorsing the fact that they feel a sense they're experiencing grief, which of course is that sadness, and also at the heart of grief is a yearning and longing for what we've lost. And I think we all have that for sure, a strong yearning for things to be back in a place where they were a little more predictable. I mean, the world is not predictable anyway, but it was so much better. I mean, and so there's the grief about that, and also what often accompanies grief, in addition to anxiety, certainly sadness and yearning and longing and anxiety, but also anger and sometimes guilt. And so I have seen, I haven't been able to really watch the chat, but I've seen sort of anger float by and disgust and, disillusionment, that kind of feeling. I think that's very prominent in the grief that most of us are feeling right now. I'm guessing that's one of the things that is kind of part and parcel of missing the way it was so very much, and being kind of angry. And then also that sort of, we call it in the bereavement world, we call it caregiver self-blame, because we do take responsibility naturally for things. And I think that we blame ourselves, and maybe rightly so. Maybe we could have done something else, but it's so natural to say, oh my gosh, should I have done something different? I think that's a very natural feeling, but I think I'm talking too much, and we have to go on.
No, but that is interesting, and I'm hoping we can loop back to that at some point, Kathy. But let's see, that there's another poll question that we have here.
Okay, great.
In terms of what are some of the losses that your clients have experienced as a result of the election. I'm curious to see what people.
Right. Yeah, it looks like certainly a loss of sense of security is a big one. Safety and security.
I mean, I have to speak right away. Just so, we're getting a whole list that just keeps growing so quickly. But one of the first that I saw is people being worried about being deported, and I have to say, one of the things that I've come across in my work with immigrant families is many families today in the United States, you'll find that more and more families have at least one immigrant family member. So you're finding many families today that are mixed immigrant status. And that, of course, as you can imagine, during this time has created a tremendous amount of a loss of security, right? Any time that there is the prospect of family separation, I mean, this is something that I think, unfortunately, many low-income families of color have faced for many, many years. Many kinds of families have had to endure. But for immigrant families now to really have to come to grips with the fact that their mother, that their father, that a family member is going to have to live with, that's certainly true.
Walter, you're disappearing a little.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So that's creating a tremendous amount of insecurity.
Right, and there's one here so there are two kinds of losses that are being, I think, documented here. One is loss of very specific and very concrete kinds of things, and the other is is loss of hope, of trust, of a sense of belonging. I think that's a huge one. And, because when we lose something that's very tied to our identity, I think that is one of the big things that happens, is that all of a sudden you wonder. I mean, I can certainly say that it's not only my clients who have some kind of sense of loss of a sense of belonging, but I've had that myself. I don't know if you have, but I kind of wonder, how do I fit in this world? What is it that I can be doing, and where does a person with my value system fit anymore? And so I think and family relationships is another thing that people have been mentioning, and you mentioned also that there's been a loss of family, of closeness, I think, in families. You mentioned in your video, I was so struck by, you're mentioning the families that said they couldn't go to Thanksgiving dinner together because there's so much intense feeling about this.
Yeah, I want to, I second that notion of both a sense of family belonging. I think it's brought up this issue of family belonging into question. I think, it's been incredibly hard for a number of people to reconcile both the fact that there are these people that they're very close to and that they love, right? That believe something very different, that believe that the world should look differently. And I think that's sort of where I was coming from when thinking about like how we have those conversations with our children, right? So it's, how do we say to our children, you know what, we love, this uncle or this grandparent very, very much, and yet they believe something very different than we do, right? How do we actually reconcile all of that? And so I think for families, that's very much been difficult. But even on the grander scale, I think what you're speaking to is the sense of belonging becomes very, I think, almost an existential question for many of us. When we say we as a country, do I feel like I'm part of that we, right? What this country is doing in terms of its actions beyond its borders, do I take a sense of ownership for that? In many cases, people are struggling with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And loss of trust. I mean, we need to trust our government and the people, and we need to trust also our fellow citizens. And I think there's been a major decrement in loss of both. We don't know really if we can trust our other people in the country to vote in the right way. I mean, to really do the right thing. And then once this, we certainly can't trust the government we have right now for some of us to do the kinds of things we think are so important. Mm-hmm. But let's turn now to another question that I think is probably on the minds at least of the clinicians here, which is which basically, what do you do when your clients bring up politics in this context? I mean, maybe it was different, if they brought up politics a year or two ago, but now what do you do when they bring up politics?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I like that, right? I see listen, right?
Yeah,
How are they feeling?
Absolutely. Let them process their feelings. Yep.
Yeah. It's interesting, and I want to speak to a couple of these, Kathy. It's really interesting that I think, my just my graduate experience and my postgraduate experience, I very much learned the importance of bringing the outside world into the therapy room. For me, it's not just an intrapsychic exploration. I think, right, both my social work training and just my values of social justice believe, right, everything in the outside world impacts our mental and relational well-being. So how could the outside world not come into the room, on a day-to-day level? So yeah, I think, as folks are saying, talk about it, listen to it, hear how people are making sense of the world around them. I think that's
Again, can you move your...
Sure. I'm so sorry about that. Yeah, so I mean, I think we do our best to make sure that we figure out a way of making meaning of how people are making meaning of what's going on in the world around them. I think that's a very important piece. First of all, you have to make space for it. You have to see it as an integral part of what's going on in the therapy room.
So absolutely, and I think it's one of the things for me that's so exciting about being at a school of social work, because, as you said, it is so. I mean, it's in the drinking water here. Actually, I'm pretty sure that you need, as you said, Walter, that it's absolutely so important to bring bring all of the social world into the consulting room. That said, I think you're also talking about what we do as therapists, which is we listen, and listening, part of it is bringing in what anyone thinks is important, whatever it might be, and certainly anything from the social world. And part of it is respectful, and it's, I guess, in a way, I guess you could use the word empowering. It's so meaningful, really, to someone who you're sitting with when you're listening to them closely, and when you're validating, yes, but also responding to them. I think validating these feelings is important. That's kind of what we've been doing, this morning, because we've been talking about how we as therapists feel, but also listening carefully to someone and finding those places where you can maybe ask a question, guide a conversation. Certainly we don't have answers. I don't think there's anyone in this room or in the world at large that has an answer to the complex situations we find ourselves in right now. But we can certainly work together to clarify what we think and feel about it, and that may be the best pathway to lead eventually to action, or even lead right now to action. But so you're saying both things, I think, that you're bringing the social world in, and also you're listening very carefully in that respectful, meaningful way that actually turns out to be very, very helpful in problem solving. So just by listening, we're going to be working, we're going to be helping people problem solve the situations they're in.
And I think just to that point, and as we talk about how people grieve and what helps people during that time, yes, I think the role of a therapist, of a social worker, who is really there to support someone who is impacted by in any way by this current political climate. I think one of the things I often suggest to folks is I ask about is whether or not they have other folks to commiserate with. I mean, I think it's so, one of the things that can be so dysregulating for many of us is feeling alone in all of this. And if we're able to find other people, and that's actually the people that I found to be, to actually do the best in being able to process their grief, is if they actually got together with other folks. They would pick an evening and just have talks, right? And some of the organizing work has provided some of this for folks. But just being able to join with others to talk about this, I think, is an important piece of their process.
Such an important point, and one that we're seeing reflected right now, right here, because we're also seeing how everyone here is kind of being together and sharing some great ideas about how to work with clients and how to think about these issues.
I think we have, is that right? We have one more question coming up here. See where people are at. And of course, right, while we're doing all this work, while we're hearing people's stories and the impact that this political climate has had, we're wondering what people are doing themselves for self-care. And see a host of things, and it's really wonderful to see people just kind of offer up their a host of things that they do.
Yeah, we can get some good ideas from them, right?
I certainly can draw from it. I saw a couple of things here. Well, that's interesting, right? I actually like to search YouTube for comedic takes on recent events. I think laughing has never hurt. In whatever way possible. And I know to some degree it's helped me get through a great deal of this. And I see a lot of, it's interesting, Kathy, I also see a lot of things here that involve things like, having time with family and friends, hiking and going to the beach. I think that's such an important piece of self-care, is that while it's important to acknowledge what's going on, it's important to be in touch with what's going on and in touch of your own process, it's also important to stimulate those other parts of your mind. Those other things going on in your brain, because I think that's just it gives us a bit of a relief from some of the ongoing kind of anxiety and the ongoing distress that a lot of this.
So I want to just bring in something a little bit sidetracking us slightly, but one of the things I saw here was watch Stephen Colbert. And I think that's a really particularly wonderful idea. As you were saying, laughing is always good, but I want to bring it up for a different reason, because there is a Colbert YouTube, and you can find it on YouTube if you want, with a guest that he had whose name is Dan Gilbert. And Dan Gilbert is an interesting man who now does, I believe he now does advertising on PBS for insurance companies, but actually what he is a social psychologist with a job at Harvard, and he studies something called synthetic happiness. And that sounds like a bad thing, but it actually isn't. I mean, it's not plastic or anything like that. It's actually, synthetic happiness is just as real as any other kind, as what you might call natural happiness. And what it relates to is what I was talking about in the very beginning here, which is adaptation, adaptation to loss, or adaptation to change and unwanted change. And what his work has basically shown is that that we do that naturally, that's part of our brains are kind of wired to adapt to unwanted change, especially to unwanted change, in a way that's kind of, that will be positive, that will help us create happiness. And that all goes on out of awareness. And so part of what we've learned in our work with complicated grief and bereavement is that the problem isn't so much that people don't know how to adapt to a loss, but rather that they can get in their own way. We can get in our own way and not let that natural adaptive process happen. And the way we do that is by basically getting very caught up in some kind of issue that takes us away from accepting the reality and or thinking about moving forward in a positive way, or staying connected with those three things.
Yeah, no, that's great.
So yeah.
I want to just also just note, because a number of people have been putting it up here as well, is I do think that we do, and this is a challenge for us living in the age of social media, right? I mean, people are tuned in and locked in and linked up, right, in every possible way. I mean, it's not uncommon for me, leaving my apartment from Brooklyn, and it only takes 5 minutes until I see the next person who's on their phone checking whatever it is, right? And I think for many of us, there is this almost addictive tendency to see what the next thing is that's happening in the world. What's the next, what the next executive order is going to be. And I think we have to have some boundaries around that, because I think while, like any addiction, right, there is a desire where you're sort of chasing something to sort of be in the know and maybe quell this uneasiness of not knowing and of certainty. It actually can contribute to greater distress, to constantly be on alert as to what the next thing is going to be. So I appreciate those folks that say no news and I quit Facebook and things like that. I mean, everybody will make their decisions as they see fit, but drawing some boundaries around how you take in the news.
I just have to say one thing, because my mother actually was a state legislator in Missouri, and there's someone here who said, help my sister run for governor of Ohio. So I want to say I love it.
All right. Absolutely.
Good luck.
Thanks for calling that out. So at this point, we're going to move on to Q&A, and I'm going to be the voice of the people typing into chat. So I've been copy-pasting all of the questions that have come in so far, and then I will ask them to you, and then maybe whoever's going to speak can do a hand raise or something so you don't end up talking over each other, or some kind of signal. And Kathy, that might get your light back on.
Did it? No, I'll get up and move it. I'll be right back.
Okay. All right, so I wonder if, let's see. So Alethea asks, and Walter, you might be able to take this one. Okay. How do we deal with clients with different political views?
Oh, in many ways I was right? Someone would ask that, and at the same time excited too, right? Because how could that not?
Oh, and remember to do the mic, please.
Sorry. And how could someone how could we not have to contend with that, right? You know, I'll be honest with you. You know, it's one of those things, right? As for myself, right? For me, having to work with, you know, all different kinds of people, right? It has become more and more challenging, right, for me to tap into those that empathy that we need, right? It becomes sometimes personally challenging to tap into that understanding that I need when I see someone has a different, a pretty. I mean, I certainly have worked with folks that were very happy about the election results, and it's been a process for me to figure out how do I do that, right? So one of the things that I've come to understand is that while I may not completely agree or agree at all with someone's political views, I do have to be able to find a sense of where the humanity lies. In other words, right, I think that there is something in this person that really believes that the world is going to be a better place as a result of this election. I believe that. I believe that people, right, very much believe this world will be better. And so my role, I feel, as a therapist is to work with them to see how do you see the world being better for everybody, right? You clearly are noting that there are certain things that you yourself have felt have been going on, not been good. So there are things you think that are going to be better maybe for you. But what about for that person next door to you? Or what about for that person who you walk by down on the street? Because for me, therapy is, yes, it's about mental and physical well-being, but it's also about the well-being of our communities and of our families, our communities, and our country. So I hope to get people to have some sense of what the future is going to look like, not just for them, but for everybody.
Thank you. And we have a question for Dr. Scheer. How do you help clients and friends find out what the grief and loss means to them?
Well, I mean, that's what we do. We listen to them. We definitely listen to them. We don't have any special techniques for doing that. What we do more is focus on really doing what we can to help people adapt to the loss, and where we define adaptation in the way that I have been. So I think in that context, I guess I could say that, again, we consider active listening to be, you know, the heart of any therapy, including the one that we do. And we also talk about having a kind of, we take a kind of, what we call it a Sherpa-like therapeutic alliance, meaning that, you know, because we so respect the attitude of the native guides in the Himalayas, who are incredibly competent and talented and experienced, but they don't insert themselves into the climbs. And that's really that's the sense in which, so we bring to the consulting room a lot of expertise, because if you're going to do this work, I think it kind of, at least I felt this way, I had to learn a lot about grief to do it. And we bring tools and resources and the ability to see kind of obstacles in the pathway and to help people design their pathways, but we do it side by side, and we really contribute only when it becomes necessary to do so.
Thank you. So this is sort of a follow-up question. Pei asked earlier, she's wondering whether the stages of grief really applies to this situation because she doesn't want the end goal to be acceptance. She wants to feel that she can challenge and resist. So how do you accept and resist at the same time?
So should I answer that one too, Walter, or do you?
Why don't you take a stab at it first?
Okay, all right. Well, so acceptance does not mean, so acceptance is a funny word, and we've struggled with the word acceptance for years and years, because the way that I'm using acceptance, it means acceptance of the reality. So the reality is that we have a president that we may not be totally thrilled with. That's the acceptance. What we do about it moving forward is something totally different. And what we need to do is to be clear, to get clear about what are our values and what are our what is in a sense the consequence of this particular change, or the loss of the kind of leadership that we really want in this country. What is the consequence of that in our lives, and where can we, where can we influence it? I mean, another way to think about this is to use a strategy similar to the serenity prayer, right? We need to figure out what it is that we can't change and that we have to accept, and what it is we can change, and then try to have the wisdom to know the difference between those. And that's really what the question is about.
I just like to add one last piece to that. So I agree wholeheartedly, Kathy. This notion of acceptance, I think, is interesting because in many ways, I think that what the acceptance has done for people has not only been a need to accept, but it's been an awakening of sorts to folks.
Yeah.
In that, for many, it alerted them to the fact that there were feelings that a large portion of this population had, right? That that folks were not fully aware of at first, right? Say, like, really? There was an elected official, right? Well, I shouldn't say everybody, but many of the folks that I interact with said, how could someone where there is a reporting, such as the one that was revealed by about President Trump, about what he said about women, how could anyone really be able to look over that, look past that, and be able to still vote for him? There's no way, right? But clearly there were people there. And there is a bit of an awakening that requires some of us to do, and an acceptance that there is a large portion of the population that doesn't think the same way. Accepting that, I think.
So this one might be for Walter. So let's see. As a therapist, Thea asks, as a therapist, do you have a policy regarding ICE coming to your office or clinical settings?
Yeah, so that's actually something that many of us in a lot of institutions and a lot of us in private practice have actually been getting together, and I actually would advise those of you, if you're in private practice, to get together with other private practitioners and talk about this, because I think it's bound to come up. So I belong, to a group of at the Ackerman Institute. I belong to a small group of therapists of color who talk about kind of the issues that we encounter as therapists in our work. And one of the things that we've come across is talking and thinking about how our immigrant families that we work with are impacted and could be impacted. And we're in the process, I think, and I and some other folks are in the process of developing some ideas of some ways of responding to if ICE were to ever come to our offices. Now, we have private practices, and we have the privilege of actually not opening the door to anyone we don't want to open the door to. We're able to educate ourselves on what the rights are, what we are required to do, and we're also bound by confidentiality guidelines to protect those that we work with. So we stand by those guidelines as far as we can. It hasn't had to go further than that. But my number one suggestion would be get together with other private practitioners to talk about how you all want to kind of organize around that.
Thank you. So we have a question from Arlene who asks, as a practicing psychotherapist, one of my patients is experiencing very intense anxiety regarding the benefits that he might lose if the Affordable Care Act is dismantled. Do you have any suggestions on how I could assist him with him?
So I guess, experiencing, I mean, again, it's kind of like what we've been, I think, pretty much talking about. First of all, validating the idea that he would be experiencing anxiety, but then listening to what is the intense anxiety about, and how can you help this person problem solve it. So, I mean, unfortunately, we're in a reality where there are things that that I think any of us would feel intensely anxious about. I don't know what the specific circumstances are that is being referred to here, but there is a reality to it. But what we know about anxiety actually is that a little bit, if we have too little anxiety, we can't problem solve very well. And if we have too much anxiety, we can't problem solve too well. So one thing would be to talk with this person about whether he thinks he's able to problem solve with the level of anxiety that he has. And if he were to say, well, no, I can't stop thinking about this, that's kind of what it sounds like, then, then that would be an opening to kind of suggest some anxiety management strategies. And there are, of course, a lot of those out there. Things like mindfulness, various kinds of, it really depends, again, but various kinds of exposure strategies actually work for a lot of anxieties. Cognitive reframing can work for anxiety. So we all know that there are strategies for working with anxiety. And I think the trick here is to both acknowledge the reality of the situation and then get the person on board to want to deal with that kind of internally first. Because then there may be some, down the road, there may be some things, political action type things that the person might want to get involved in to start to deal with this too. Or community-based things, but I think the first thing is to get on the same page about what the first step here is. And it sounds like the first step would be, in a sense, helping this person manage that high level of anxiety.
I agree, and I of course, the irony here, Kathy, right, is that for folks who are seeking some support with managing that anxiety, if they lose their health insurance, that might be even more challenging for them to do.
Right.
So it's I think it's to whatever extent possible, right? And this is, I think, a running theme throughout what we've been talking about is really being able to listen and to validate what it means for someone to lose, right? If we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, to lose a basic need that this person has to ensure that their health is secure in some way, and that is, I think, being able to really, really sit with someone and understand that. And I think that to whatever extent possible, those anxiety management techniques will be critical. I do, and this is more from putting on my advocacy hat, is I do think also in some cases some of those management strategies involve becoming active to ensure that, the Affordable Care Act doesn't get repealed, or that, that there are measures in place that they can ensure that there some level of health care is maintained.
Absolutely. But, I just want to make the point that you may not be able to be effective as an advocate if you're experiencing such a high level of anxiety that you can hardly think straight. And, I think that does sometimes happen. So you're right. I think we need, that kind of balance, and it's hard.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Tanya asks, what are the general statistics of clients going to psychotherapists due to political issues, and has it skyrocketed since Trump? Do we know that?
I don't.
Yeah. Well, I can say this, and I certainly don't have hard data to support it. Just anecdotal. I can say for sure, rarely do you ever see on an intake, right? Presenting problem is current political climate is placing an extreme, is imparting an extreme sense of stress and strain on this individual. I think I think if I could reframe that a little bit is I don't know how many people are coming into therapy to talk about this. However, that also says something for how much space we as therapists make to talk about it, right? Because I think for a very, very long time, I think in the field of psychotherapy, we did not see those issues as part of the clinical work. And it's only until recently that we've really seen the value of talking about that in the room. So I think a lot of it is not only just about people coming in with those presenting problems, but it's how much space we actually make for it and how much space we give license to be able to talk about it as part of the therapy.
Actually, someone's written that they work at a rape crisis center where they've definitely seen an increase. So I would guess that people have seen an increase. And actually, it makes sense that for all the reasons, Walter, you've been pointing out, that the social world matters a huge amount to our internal psychological state. And so it would be almost impossible to imagine that there hasn't been an increase in, in visits, maybe not specifically for this, but basically triggered by it anyway.
Mm-hmm. All right, we have time for one more question, and this question comes from Pei. What do you see the role of a clinician in terms of educating the client if they don't realize their action is against what they value? So, for example, a client who said the GOP did the right thing to repeal Obamacare, but they were happy to get insurance in 2010, which was Obamacare.
I'll say a few words about this. I mean, I think, listen, first of all, I sometimes sort of hesitate at even using the word educate, because I think that we have to be very careful about, the level of power that we hold as therapists in the room, as social workers in the room. I always try to be very mindful of that. At the same time, I often do take a stance. A clinical stance that I take is very much a stance of, let's look at the way you're looking at the world, at your world right now. In what ways is this way that you're looking at it serving you well, and in what ways is it constraining you? And having people really tease that out in a way that hopefully, I'm very much a believer in helping to bring forth as opposed to put forth. In other words, people coming to the realizations that, there are things that maybe on the face of it they may feel really serve a particular purpose or serve a certain belief system, but there may be other dimensions of it or other aspects of it that actually hurt them. And actually, because I think there's often we find that to be the case in life. So my stance is one of trying to see how these things both serve us well, but also constrain us. And from that, I hope people will come to it.
If I could just add one thing to this, I think that paradigm that you raised, it is a kind of, it's one, if I heard it, I would feel really frustrated. And I think one of the things about whether we're going to address this for the client, we have to be sure we're doing it for the client's sake and not ours. Because if we're frustrated, we may want to, set the client right in a sense, but it may not be that important to the clients. It depends on the larger context. It may be important, and then what Walter's saying, absolutely, I would agree with, but maybe it isn't that important to the client, but it's frustrating me or aggravating me, and so then I don't want to basically go there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we are right at our time limit, so I'm just going to point out we have the handouts, over on this side if you'd like to download any of them. And you're welcome at our future events. Please join us. We really appreciate having you here. Complicated Grief has some workshops coming up, and you can download the workshop handouts over here or click on these links. And if you'd like to have a workshop with Walter Vega, he'll be here Friday, May 19th. So the link is here for that as well. And a giant thank you. So thank you to Professor Scheer and Professor Vega for spending the time with us today. We really appreciate your insights, and thank you to all the participants who joined us as well today. It was really wonderful to see all your participation.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for organizing.
So our event, yep, no problem. Our event's over. We'll stay for maybe 10 more minutes if you'd like to just chat informally. And feel free to download slides. And I see some questions about the resources, so we are gathering them, and they'll be written up and put onto our website. And I see lots of your amazings for our presenters. And early at the beginning, there were some former students of yours here who said that you were the best professors they had here at Columbia. So it's really a pleasure to have you both here.
Thanks so much, Mattia. And unfortunately, I am not going to be able to stay for the 10 minutes. I hope that's okay. I apologize.
Yeah. Yep.
Things are really out of control. It's probably Trump's fault, I'm pretty sure.
Sounds about right. Sounds about right.
Okay.
Well, thank you for being here.
Okay.
I can stick around for a few minutes.
Great. So I see a lot of thank yous coming in. People appreciated that last joke. So, Walter, I have some more questions, and maybe I'll just see if there's time for one or two. So Anna had asked for any advice about helping entice undocumented public school students to overcome their fear of attending school instead of going into hiding.
Say that again.
Oh, Anna asked, how do we entice undocumented public school students to overcome their fear of attending school instead of hiding?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, and I assume embedded in that question is already an understanding that any kind of, call to undocumented students to do anything is going to be met with suspicion. And I'm going to assume that that's already embedded in the question. I think that, first of all, so much of this is about personal relationships, right? So in earlier in questions that I was asking about, what stood out for me, that young lady who's a dreamer, that's someone who I developed a really close working relationship. And I think, almost on a one-on-one basis, you really have to form these connections with folks and these relationships with them, and for them to develop a sense of trust in you as an ally, as a real ally, because it becomes incredibly difficult to ask someone to be a part of something that could be, theoretically, it certainly would be beneficial for them. It becomes very difficult to ask that of them when they feel, well, wait a minute, so many times, and we're living in an environment that's so unsafe. There's no reason why I would do that. You seem like a very nice person, but that's not something that's risk. Or so it really is about working individually with them. All the stuff that Kathy and I had talked about in terms of really listening, understanding, validating, acknowledging, and seeing where those small opportunities for change lie. Because it's often when people feel the most heard that they're willing to travel with.
Thank you. And I think this might be our last question. This one's from Latricia. So how do you manage clients that are overly assertive, borderline aggressive, trying to get you to discuss your political party or political perspective?
Yeah. So I think, to me, so I want to make the distinction between, kind of the political piece of it, because I don't, for example, while it could probably be assumed, I don't discuss who specifically I vote for. I don't talk about specific policy I vote for, but I talk about my values. I certainly will talk about my values in making the world a better place, my values of racial justice, my values in there being, a more just society for low-income people. So, if I feel sort of an aggressive pursuit in terms of my politics, I respectfully turn that down and say, well, for me, this is not the place to be talking about specific politics. However, I have actually, part of the work that I do with my clients is share with them a little bit about myself. And that's a whole, maybe a webinar for a whole other day, use of self-disclosure, right, in psychotherapy. But there is a piece of me and my values that I share with folks. And that sometimes are points of connection with them, and that sometimes is a point of difference. But that at least we can talk about. The politics themselves, I feel like that's a political discussion. It's not about relationship.
Great. Well, thank you, Walter. So I think that's all the time we have for questions. We didn't get to all the questions, and I apologize for that. But I really appreciate all the active participation and the great questions that came in, and the participants helping other people. So that was great that within the chat, people were answering each other's questions. So that was really wonderful, too.
Excellent.
So
all right.
I see some thanks. Yeah, so thank you. Thank you, Walter.
All right. Thank you. And yeah, have a great day, everybody.
Thanks. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a great day, and please come to our future events because we really love to have you here.